Or okay, great. Give me one. All right, hi everyone, and welcome to our lecture 7 on Node.js and NPM. And I'm Alex. You might remember me from the first lecture. But yeah, before we talk about Node, let's actually do a quick recap of the last lecture, which is asynchronous JavaScript. And we know that we didn't really cover await, and that's why we are going to talk about await as well. And actually, before we talk about await, let's do a quick recap. So first of all, async keyword. That's what you have learned in the previous asynchronous JavaScript lecture. Essentially, just as a quick recap, the word async before a function means one simple thing. A function always returns a promise. And if a function is without the async keyword, the function will just return its normal value. And other values are wrapped in a resolved promise automatically. So for instance, if you look at the screenshot of the code snippet down below, as you can see for function f, there is a async keyword in front of the function keyword. And that async keyword, by including it, when we call the function, it will not just return a 1, but it will return a promise that if it is resolved, it will be equal to a 1. So as a result, when we call this function, as you can see here, have brackets, and then since this returns a promise, we cannot directly use it. As a result, we need to use .then method to resolve this promise. And how the .then method works, just as a recap, is essentially takes in a function, and if the promise resolves successfully, it will run this function. So the result of this arrow function here, as you can see, it will print out 1 in the terminal. So yeah, this is async keyword. Actually, before we move on to await, are there any quick questions?
You did .then, you put result in, even though you didn't write anything that said result or define result, does it just implicitly know that what result is?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to reiterate, the question is, so inside the .then method here, we use a result, result as a parameter. What would happen if we, for instance, switch to another parameter or we use something else? Like how does it know? So essentially how this works, this is essentially an arrow function. So this is kind of like a parameter name. And whatever you set the parameter name to be, it doesn't really matter. And the most important thing is that the result here inside the parameter matches with the function value, like the result here. So let's say we want to change it to another parameter name, for instance, like response. We can simply change result to response and then change the corresponding result to response as well. It will work just fine. Does it make sense? Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right. And also, if you found async kind of confusing, feel free to rewatch the lecture 6, which is the last lecture. Also, there's lesson plans on the website. Yeah. And cool. And now let's talk about await keyword. I believe there is some await keyword inside the latest framework. And that's also why we decided to talk about await here. So essentially, if we look at the last slide, here as you can see, dealing with promise is not really that intuitive. We need to, after we call a function, we need to chain it with a .then method. And then inside the .then method, we then need to pass in another arrow function. And that just seems pretty redundant, not gonna lie. And that's why we introduced a await keyword. And by using a await keyword, we can have a much clearer way and also kind of like a very synchronous style of writing asynchronous function. So Yeah, the await keyword provides a much clearer way, blah, blah, blah. And with await, you can process async function just like synchronous ones. And as you can see on the left, this is just me copying the previous code snippet here. And on the right, this is how we are going to write the function on the right, a function on the left using await keyword. So as you can see, the function f itself does not really change. It's still an asynchronous function, but the way that we call it changes a little bit. As you can see, we do let result equals await f. And what this does is that by using the await keyword, it will await the promise result. So essentially, you can think of promise as something that takes a little bit of time to process. And by using await, it will effectively convert this promise to a normal kind of like value. So as you can see, this is very much like how we would usually write. If we get rid of async, if we get rid of await, it will just be like function f, and then we call it here. This all makes sense, right? So await essentially it converts kind of like asynchronous function to asynchronous ones, and it's just a much kind of like clearer way to write it. And also one of the kind of like motivation behind JavaScript inventing await keyword is that it also helps solve very long .then chains problem. So if you imagine something like, if you look at like the first code snippet here, as you can see, there are like a lot of .then chained together because the first function, the fetch function, returns a promise, and then the .json method actually returns a promise again, and then the user.fetch profile method, it returns a promise again. So this is like a really strange way of writing code. And if we want to like chain 10 functions together, it won't be like nested very deep inside the .then method. This is not kind of like the best way to write our code. And as a result, by using await, as you can see here on the second code snippet, it's just much clearer. As you can see, after we call fetch, and here fetch is a asynchronous function. You don't really know about it, but yeah, it's just an asynchronous function. And by using await in front of fetch, we then can convert it into kind of like a synchronous value. And then when we call response.json, here again, .json is a asynchronous function. So we use await again, and this will also convert the result to a synchronous value. As a result, we can just simply use .fetch profile function. And after using await, the .fetch profile is just something I make up. Doesn't really matter. And the most important thing about this is it's a asynchronous function. And we then again use await to convert it from an asynchronous value to a synchronous value. And this kind of like way to write asynchronous function to process multiple asynchronous functions together is a much more ideal way than simply chain all the promises together using .then. Okay, do we have any questions so far for await? All right. Now let's move on to the main topic of today, which is Node.js and also NPM. So what is Node.js? You can visit the official website for Node here. But essentially, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. You can think of it as kind of like another way of running JavaScript. So usually when we write JavaScript, you can only run it on browser, right? You can't really run it outside of the browser. But with the help of Node.js, you can actually run Node.js. You can actually run JavaScript without a browser on your own local computer. And what this means is that it gives JavaScript the freedom to kind of like behave as a server-side language. So for instance, if you think about like Python, Python is a language that doesn't really rely on anything to run, right? It doesn't really rely on a browser. And with the help of Node.js, it can also make JavaScript a server-side language, which means that it's kind of similar to Python, where you can just run it on your own local computer. And yeah, so with the ability to run JavaScript locally on computer, we can also download a rich number of packages from a large community. And this is, if you are familiar with Python, this is pretty similar to how pip works as well. So usually in Python, you can download packages from outside using like pip install. And in JavaScript for Node.js, we can do something very similar. Okay. So just as a quick recap, Node is essentially an engine that allows you to run JavaScript outside of the browser. And let's talk about NPM. So NPM is abbreviated for Node Package Manager. And it's a place where you can find and download other Node packages. So let's say you want to create some crazy 3D visualizations. And it's very, very hard to do it on your own without any like 3D graphics knowledge. But with the help of a community of passionate developers and also the tool NPM, you can simply use NPM install 3. 3 is the package name for the 3D visualization tool in JavaScript. And after you do this, you can install a package to help you with that with some already packaged function. And you can visit NPM here. Essentially, this is a package manager that allows you to download outside packages from the other developers, also maybe some companies. And throughout this course, we will be using NPM very extensively. So for instance, we are going to introduce React in the future, probably in the next course actually. And React is also a package that's like built on NPM. And when you're writing React, you need to download a bunch of other packages, and this is all done by NPM. Are there any questions so far for Node.js or NPM? Cool. And before we move on, let's briefly talk about some differences between the normal kind of like vanilla JavaScript, the JavaScript that runs in the browser, versus the JavaScript that we are introducing today, running on Node. And the main thing is there isn't too much differences in terms of like syntax, but we do have, but there are certain things that we cannot do on Node.js. So if you remember, Node.js is something that's kind of like outside of the browser. We can run it on our local machine. And this means that when we are using JavaScript inside Node.js, we does not have any document-related functionalities. And that's because we don't really have a browser window. And as a result, we can't really work with it. And the document-related functionalities, they all relate to the browser window. Since we don't have it, we just are not going to have any document-related functionalities. And so for instance, if you try to do document.getElementById followed by some ID, this should be pretty familiar to. It will work on the JavaScript on browser, but it won't work on Node.js. Because Node.js, it doesn't have the concept of a document object. Okay. And another important difference is that for Node.js, we use a require keyword to import packages. So for instance, we have downloaded some package from NPM, and we want to import it so that we can use it. And the way to do that is by doing constant followed by the package name and equals required followed by the package name. So this is how we will import package from outside. If you try to do this require keyword inside the browsers, let's say, it won't really work because the require keyword simply doesn't work on browser. So yeah, this is kind of like a unique way for Node.js to install packages. And additionally, with Node.js, we have many more added functionalities. So since we're no longer limited to the browser, we can now interact with our local file system. And well, the JavaScript on browser, it actually can sort of interact with the local file system without cookies, but it's not like you really interact with it. And so for instance, in Node.js, you can create a file very simply. You can delete a file on a computer, also very simply. You can also set up a web server and various other things that you cannot achieve using vanilla JavaScript. And usually people use vanilla JavaScript to refer to the JavaScript inside browser. Yeah. Any questions so far for the differences between Node.js and JS browser? All right. And like we just mentioned, we can use Node.js to build a web server. And this is kind of like the main use case for us in our course. And today we're going to build a pretty simple web server. In the course in the future, when we cover backend lectures, we're going to build some very complex web server. But yeah, today it's going to be a pretty easy one. And we are also going to introduce what's Express. Express is essentially a package on NPM that you can use to create web server with ease. And before we dive into the implementation detail, let's briefly look at what's a web server. So when people think about like web server, it might be something that's like pretty mysterious, that's like up in the cloud, something like that. But if we look at the core of the web server, it's not really super complex. Essentially, a web server only does one thing. It accepts HTTP requests and sends back HTTP responses. So let's say we have a Facebook web server, right? And when the user wants to log into Facebook, they then on their browsers, they type in their password, they type in their username, and after they click login, their browser, for instance, Chrome, will send a HTTP request to the web server for Facebook. And then after Facebook receives that request, it will process that request, compare the password that the user entered with the password inside the database, and then sending back the HTTP response. Essentially, what this is all that a web server does. It's pretty straightforward. It takes a response, process it, and send back the corresponding. It takes a request, process it, and send back the corresponding response. And also, usually a web server, it contains an HTTP server, also a bunch of files. The files also includes databases, things that we'll definitely cover in our course. And yeah, let's again take a quick look at the process of a user logging into Facebook. So we start at step one. And step one, after the user types in their password, their username, and once they hit enter, the browser will send a HTTP request containing user's username and password to Facebook server. And once the Facebook server receives that username and password, it will compare the user's password with the one in the database. And if it matches, it will then send back the user's information and probably also status code saying that the user successfully logs in. And along with the login token, we'll talk about login token in the future, but essentially this is how the devices that you're using will remember like your username and your password without you typing into it. And if the user's password does not match with the one in the database, we'll probably send out like a error response, and then you will not be logged in. So yeah, this is kind of like a pretty simple process of a user logging to Facebook. We have abstracted away quite a lot of details, but this is essentially kind of like a high-level, big picture overview of the process. Does this make sense? Do we have any questions? All right. Now let's take a look at a very simple web server example. And can we see this clearly? Okay, I think everyone can. And okay, so this is JavaScript code. It's all like JavaScript code, but it's JavaScript wrote in Node.js. Okay. And here, as you can see, we have const axios equals require axios. And this is how we essentially import the package. And for this particular web server, we're going to use axios. Actually, we're not going to use axios. I don't know why I put it here. But essentially, axios is a way for the web server to send in HTTP requests to other servers. This is pretty useful. We're going to cover this in a future lecture. But the package that we are going to use mainly for today is the express package, which is like const express equals require express here. And this is the only package that we're going to pretty much use today. And after we have imported all the required packages, we then establish kind of like the port that we're going to use. We don't really need to save it as a variable, but this is just kind of like a good practice to set the port right before we start. And usually we use a port that's like 3000. Anything that's above 3000 or equals to 3000 works fine. People also use like 3030, 3010, it doesn't really matter. And a port is essentially kind of like an entrance to a machine. So for instance, on your own computer, you can also open the port on 3000 or on 8000 or 8080, it doesn't really matter, but this is kind of like an entrance to your computer. And once we establish the port, we then create an app. And this is how the express syntax works essentially. You have to, first of all, call the express package. This will create an express app. And after we create an express app, we can then build on top of this express app, and we can establish a web server pretty simply by using this app. So as you can see, so after we establish the app here, we have app.get followed by an arrow function. And app.get is essentially saying that we will, on this app, when we receive a GET request. So GET request is a form of HTTP request. We also have many other requests. For instance, a put request, a delete request, a post request. But right now we are just processing a GET request. And don't worry too much if you feel like this is kind of like complicated for now. It's okay, and we are going to cover this again in the future lectures about like various types of requests. But right now, we're only processing a GET request. And the GET request is usually for the user to get a certain information. So let's say when you go on to Berkeley, the official like Berkeley website, the browser you're using are probably sending a GET request to the Berkeley web server. And followed by the GET request, we have a slash. And this slash is essentially saying that we will send the GET request to the root directory, the root website of our web server. And right here, if you look at app.listen, this is where our web server is located. It's located at HTTP, localhost, home, followed by 3000. So this is kind of like our website. And app.get followed by a slash, it simply means that we're going to visit that particular website, not any sub-website, subdomain within that website. So this method is essentially saying that if we receive a GET request at our root website, we then send back a hello world to the user. What this does is that, for instance, if a user uses a browser to visit this URL, like HTTP localhost 3000, the browser will send a GET request automatically to the web server. And then the web server, if it functions like properly, will send back a hello world. And then on the user's browser screen, they will see a hello world appear. And yeah, so this is essentially how the Express server works. And there's also app.listen here. It's listening on the port that we have established earlier. It's essentially 3000. And after this listen, like the second parameter for this listen method is the arrow function. And this arrow function is simply saying that once the web server is starts to listen on this port, then we'll execute this function. And this function, as you can see, is console.log, essentially saying that our example app is starts to run and is listening after our particular URL. So yeah, before we move on to kind of like demonstrate this simple web server, do we have any questions? Oh yeah, that's a great question. So the question is asking what's the rec and the res here? And the rec and the res here are two parameters, and it stands for request and response. And this is how a web server will refer to users' request. So let's say when user is sending a request, yeah, it might also contain some extra information. So let's say when a user logs into Facebook, they need to provide their username and also password. And the way for Facebook to access their password and username is usually stored inside this request parameter. So if it's stored inside the request body, we can then do like request.body.password. Then we can like get access to that password. And right now, since this is like simply a GET request, it doesn't really contain any information. So we don't really use the request parameter. And the response parameter is kind of like a shorthanded way for you to handle response. And usually the only thing that we do is we do response.send. And this is essentially a way for the web server to send back the response to the user. And as far as I can tell in this course, at least, this is all we are going to use, like response.send. This is kind of like a way that Express gives our developers a way to kind of like interact with response. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the order is first of all, when we start up the web server, we'll listen for any kind of responses. And for this particular route, we call this a route. It's listening at kind of like the root directory, the root website, the root URL. And then once we receive a GET response from the user, then we send back a hello world to the user. Does this make sense? Okay. Do we have any other questions? Alrighty. Now okay, before we move on, I guess let's do the magic word for today. And the magic word for today is node. Yeah, so There should be a tennis link on Piazza, if I'm not mistaken. All right. Cool. Now let's go to the live demo. And for this live demo, we're going to, first of all, demonstrate a very simple web server, which is just the one that's shown before. And we're also going to do a slightly more complex web server that's going to process some users' requests. And finally, we are going to demonstrate how we can use Node to interact with the local file system. And you can find everything here inside this link. So feel free to go to this link and call them up. It's right here. And it's under the Node demo folder right here. And you can see the search folders. I have already cloned that into my computer. I mean, because I wrote it. So let's first of all go to SP 2020 lectures, and then go to Node demo. Now let's go. All right. So right here we have 3 folders. And we are going to focus right now on the first folder, which is the simple web server. Can I borrow a charger from someone? Like an electric charger? The repo? Oh, yeah. So why is there so Alrighty, let's continue. Thanks a lot for the charger. Alrighty, we are back. And hope everyone has the time to call a repo. And let's get started with the demo. And let's go to the simple web server here. And I guess actually I should just go over the kind of like the installation guide. And if you want to start with say empty folder instead of kind of like a build out folder, that's totally fine as well. And that's actually what I recommended. So kind of like to create all this, I have created a pretty short README guide. Inside the readme.md here, first of all, to create any node packages, we need to do npm init. And let's actually here. Demo. Demo folder. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and create a web server from this stuff. So since a web server is kind of like relies on Node, anything that relies on Node, you should build it as an npm package. So let's do npm init. npm init is essentially the way for you to create any Node packages. And if you do npm init without the -y flag, it will ask you a bunch of things. For instance, the package name, the version. If you hit enter, it will just go through this one by one. And I will just like make everything the default value. But usually, if you want to like skip that step, you can simply add in a -y flag. And so once you have created npm init, you can see there's a package.json file appear inside the folder. And the package.json file is kind of like a configuration file for npm and also for your package. And by including this package.json file, the Node and the npm will have an idea of how many packages that your package need and what sorts of package is that for your own package. So this is essentially a configuration file. We can also take a look. So inside demo, package.json, as you can see, here it has a name, a version, a description, a bunch of things that we have like entered as a default. And once we install that package, will actually show up here as well. So since we need to use the express package, let's do npm install express. Cool. So once we've added this express package, if we go back to package.json, as you can see here, there's a new field called dependencies up here. And inside dependencies, there's express followed by the version number. This up arrow is essentially saying that anything that's any express that's higher than 4.17.3 version is good for us. And this, like the selecting version, this is all done automatically, so you don't really need to worry about it. And besides this package.json changes, we also see there's a package lock.json. And this is essentially a way, also another configuration file, but this is mainly used to track all the dependencies, and also the dependency that's used by more dependencies. As you can see, certainly we have a lot of dependencies, but that's all right. We don't really need to care about it too much. Also, there's a node modules folder here. And this node modules, it contains all the dependencies that come with the express package. As you can see, there are a lot of dependencies. And this is kind of like one, not really a downside, but one feature of JavaScript, especially in Node. When you install kind of like one package, you are forced to install a bunch of other packages that this package required, depending on. Yeah, so we don't really need to worry about it. And just kind of like as a quick note, when you try to, let's say, publish a package or just try to upload your package to GitHub, you don't really need to add all these node modules inside your Git. And the reason for that is when someone downloads your package, they can simply do an npm install followed by like no parameter, and this will install all the package that's like that's displayed here under dependencies field. And this really kind of like decreases the size of our JavaScript package, which is a pretty good practice. So yeah. Before we move on, are there any questions so far? Um, mhm. Okay, so the question is, what's the difference between doing kind of like everything from the start, like just Sean, versus downloading it from our GitHub repo, the link that I provided. So I would say the main difference is that you essentially achieve the same thing, but installing it by yourself can like make you more familiar with the process. But other than that, it's pretty much the same. You can simply download it from a repo, or you can do it by hand.
For the dependencies express, so how does the 4.17.3 correspond to, corresponds to the new one?
Oh, the node modules. So usually what NPM does is that it will install the latest package. And for the node module is kind of like a place that contains all the packages. So for instance, inside node modules, there should probably be express units here. And for this particular express, it's version 4.17.3. And yeah, this is kind of like the relationship of it. And usually you don't really need to care about the version number that much because NPM do that for you. But sometimes there's like version conflict and you need to resolve it by hand. But this rarely happens. So. And do we have any other questions? Mhm. Oh yeah, for sure. It's inside here. If you want to follow along, there's also instructions here inside each folder. So inside each folder, there's a README file. README is usually called the place that you put some instructions for packages. And here, yeah, to create an NPM package, you do NPM -y. And then to install Express, you do NPM install Express. You mean like index.js? Oh, dash Y. Yeah. So npm init is the way to like initialize a package. And if you do dash Y, it will default everything to call the default value. And if you don't do dash Y, as you can see from our previous demo, you kind of like need to enter this packet or just like keep pressing it. So usually we do dash Y because you can also change it later inside package.json. But yeah. Oh, when we're okay, so yeah, when we are initializing a package, we're usually like building a package from scratch. And when we are downloading a package, we're usually like downloading someone else's package.
Right. So then why did we go to
Oh, okay. So yeah, we're first of all initializing our own web server. And to build our own web server, we need to have the Express package to build our own package. Yeah. So yeah. So right now we are building kind of like a very simple web server package, and this particular package will require the Express package that's already built. Do we have any other questions? Okay, yeah, so great question. Someone asked if when they're doing the npm init-y, they receive the error message of like command not found, and that's because you haven't downloaded npm yet. So what you need to do is go to, so there's a link on the slide, probably like somewhere here. You go to npm.js.com, and then you need to like install npm. Also make sure you have installed Node already. And after you install like both npm, also like Node.js, you will be able to run the command. Do we have any other questions, concerns? Cool. Alrighty. So right now we have successfully installed Express. And the next step is for us to build our simple web server. So let's go ahead and create a file called index.js. And the reason for us to name it as, oops, I created outside the folder. Let me move. Okay. And the reason for us to call it index.js is that if we look at package.json file, there is a main field here. The main field is default to index.js. This is essentially kind of like an entry point for a package, and it's default to calling index.js. If you want to call your JavaScript file some other name, it's totally fine. You just need to make sure you change the name that's written in package.json file. So right now we have our index.js file, and let's go ahead and try to create our web server. So the first thing that we need to do is to import the Express package. So let's do const express. Okay. You might see the code automatically like fill, and that's because I'm using GitHub Autopilot. But yeah, this is how we will import a package. And once we've imported the package, remember the second thing that we should do is we should establish a port. And let's say that we are going to use, let's say we're going to use 3000 as our port. And okay, now we have our port and we have our Express package. The next thing that we're going to do is to establish an Express app. So let's go ahead and do const app equals to response. Okay. And after we have created an app, we can essentially start to do all the routes. And actually, before we do all the routes, let's take a look at the index.js file. Before all these routes can start to actually listening on those like routes, we first of all need to have this method in place. So let's copy and paste it here. And after listen, it guarantees that once you run this index.js file using Node, it will start a web server that's listening on that particular port, which is a 3000 port. And you can do it like this after listen port, but this will not like console.log any message to our terminal. So usually what we do is we also include kind of like a callback function here, so that once the app starts to listening on 3000 port, it will also console.log kind of like a message out inside the terminal. So I have saved the file, and let's go ahead and run it. And notice how right now we don't actually have any like app.get, app.put, like we don't have any actual method that will return the user anything. But we can still run the web server. So let's go ahead and do that. And to run the web server, we do node index.js. And once you hit enter, as you can see, it will say example app listening at localhost 3000. And that's essentially an indication that our app is up and running. And to stop the app from running, we can do Control C. If you're on Mac, probably something else on Windows. And cool. And before we move on to building our first route, are there any questions? Mhm. Realistically, it's kind of like okay, so the question is, what does support kind of like realistically mean in real life? It's essentially an entrance or kind of like an opening that your computer provides to the outside world. So let's say you are browsing the internet, and usually a web page, like one web page corresponds to one, um, like, yeah, you can sort of argue like that, but one web page that you open in your browser corresponds to kind of like one third. And so there's kind of like a limited amount of web services that you can open, depends on kind of like the number of ports that you have. But usually this number is like 5,000 or 6,000, so you don't really need to worry about that. But yeah, so when we are opening kind of like a port, this is essentially saying that other users, when they're using our web server, they can send the request to that particular port. And by using that port, we'll also sending back responses to them. But this is all through this particular port. Are there any other questions? Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, so the command is node index.js. Here. Do we have any other questions? All right, and now let's move on to adding our first route. And just like what we have explained, for our very first route, we're going to do something pretty easy. It's app.get, and followed by a bracket. And then after the bracket, so the first parameter is kind of like the domain that we want to listen to for this get method. So let's do this. And this kind of like a slash is just indicating that when the user visits localhost 3000, if they send a get request to us, and then we'll respond to them in a certain way. And if, for instance, you do like about, and then if the user visit like localhost 3000, they will actually not receive it. Only if they visit localhost 3000 slash about, they will then be greeted with some message. Right now, let's just do a slash, and followed by an arrow function containing the request and also its response. So let's do that. Request response. And then followed by rest of send hello world. And this hello world and this rest of send, it will essentially sending a hello world message as a JSON file, as a JSON HTTP response to the user. So let's save this file, and then let's go on to our terminal, run node index.js, and let's open up our local host something. Cool. As you can see, we receive hello world inside our browser. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so usually the slash kind of like just indicate the root domain, and Yeah, but usually when you include a slash, for instance here, our browser will omit a slash for, I believe, aesthetics purpose. But yeah, does this answer your question? Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, for sure. So the command to run that is node index.js. Is that what you're looking for? Okay. Yeah, so node index.js is essentially saying that for node.js, you need to start running that file, which is index.js. Um, yes. Yes. So when we are typing like localhost 3000 in our browser, and once we hit enter, we are actually like the browser are actually sending a GET request to the web server that we have just built. And our web server, as a result, will send back kind of like a hello world response to the browser. And as a result, you can see the hello world displayed inside here. Mhm. Oh yeah, RUQ right here, it doesn't really serve any purpose. So we can actually just like omit it by doing like this. And but usually it stands for request, and it's a way to kind of like access the extra information that's stored inside a request. So let's say if the user sends a request, sends a login request, then the request should probably contain like the password and the username, and we can access those information using the request parameter. Any other questions? Mhm. I think the order does matter. I'm not even sure. Let's try this out. Okay, right now I am reversing the orders. Let's open it up again. And let's visit. Okay, seems like it's working just fine. So the order doesn't really matter. Do we have any other questions, concerns? Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So request and response, this is kind of like a, this is two objects that Express kind of like gives us. And so it's kind of like specific to different routes. So let's say we have another route here, saying something like, for instance, here it's A, B, C, D. And then this kind of like, if there's a request object here and there's another request object here, these two request objects will be different from each other. I think they are like specific to each request, but kind of like the way for us to process it are really pretty much the same. We can access all the attributes inside by using like request body, blah, 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 blah. We'll be demonstrating how to use request later as well in today's lecture. Mhm.
Since you created the document ABCD, if you input the hello and you type
Yeah, let's try this out. So right now I have app.get ABCD, and instead of hello world, I change it to hello ABCD. Let's stop our server and open it up again. As you can see, hello world doesn't really change. And if we go to A, B, C, D, and hit enter, as you can see, it shows hello ABCD on the screen. So yeah, it does change the port route that you're on. And yeah. Do we have any other questions? Software. Alrighty. Now, let's move on to a more complex example. As you can see, this is essentially what we have built inside our first folder. And inside our second folder, this is a kind of like a more complex example of a web server. As you can see here, there are 3 routes. The first route is just the same. We have app.get. And let me just delete this because we use them. And the second route is app.post. And this is essentially a route that corresponds to a post request. And it's under the URL is hotdog. And Silicon Valley is a great show, and I want to see it. And this is a quick Silicon Valley reference. And we also have another route here, app.put. This is essentially saying that when the user visits this particular URL, using a put request, we'll be responding them with something else. So let's look at them one by one. So first of all, app.post. In app.post, we are essentially processing all the post requests inside the is.hotdog route. And post requests usually correspond to when the user fill out a form. So let's say the user tries to log into Facebook, and when they enter their username, their password, and then they click login, the browser will actually send a post request. And that particular post request contains the user's username and the password. And that post request will be then sent to Facebook server and then process it. And right here, instead of kind of like instead of like logging in, we're just sending a food item to the is.hotdog link. And so as you can see, so once we have sent, once we have received the user's post request, we'll then grab request.body.food. So this is essentially assuming that the user has already put something inside the request body, and inside the request body there's a food field, and then we get that particular food field's value. And if that food's value is equal to hotdog, we'll then send back a response for send it's a hotdog. And if it's not a hotdog, then we'll send no, it's not hotdog. And so yeah, this is essentially what our route is trying to do. And if you remember from our previous example, when we are testing out our get route, we're actually using our browser to test it. However, to test out our post route, we can still use our browser to test out. We can write a form and then kind of like fill out the password and then use, not the password, fill out the hotdog value or the food value and then post a form. But this requires us to kind of like build a front end, which is kind of annoying to do if you're just building this web server. So there's a pretty helpful tool. It's called Postman. And Postman is a tool for us to send requests to our web server without using any browser. So let's go ahead and open up Postman. I think I get Postman from just Google and download it. But this is what it looks like. And if you have just downloaded it, you probably won't see that many requests. But on the left here, oops, dismiss. On the left here, you can create a bunch of collections, and collections are essentially just a collection of requests. And as you can see, I have already created a lesson 7 Node NPM collection. And inside this collection, we have 3 requests already built out. But let's just create one as an example. Okay. So let's delete this. And let's say we want to test on this particular route. So what we are going to do is first of all click this button and then do add request. Inside request name, you can essentially put anything. So let's just say this hotdog test, and then save to lesson 7. Okay, as you can see, this here is set that. This is because Postman usually default the request type to get request. And so right here, the request, as you can see, is post request. So let's change that to post. And for the request URL, and it's here under is hotdog. So besides doing like localhost 3000, we also need to add is hotdog followed by it. And we also need to add the food value inside the request body. So how we are going to do that is by finding the body here. We go to the body. Then we change the type to row because we do want to write the body by hand. And then we change it to JSON. JSON is essentially kind of like a way for JavaScript to transmit packages around on the internet. And let's quickly create a food field followed by, let's say, pizza. Okay. And so notice that we need to wrap every string or every like value and name here using double quotes or like single quotes, whatever, but make sure they are strings. And so once we have everything ready, and the reason why we do like food here is because we know that backend, it requires kind of like a food field inside the body. And that's why we do food. And if here is like another value, say let's say item, then we need to change the food in our body to item corresponding. So right here is food. And let's go ahead and start the server. So now to start the server, we do something pretty similar, which is node index.js. Let's hit enter. As you can see, example after this, we have localhost 3000. And if we try to do like is hotdog here, as you can see, it says cannot get is hotdog. And this is because you can't really send the post request using a browser without like any forms. And the default request for a browser is to send a get request. And however, inside like this is hotdog route, we didn't really create like app.get is hotdog. We only have app.post is. So as a result, we kind of get an error message if we visit it from a browser. And this is why we need to do it using Postman. So right now we have our post request set up. It's sending to this hotdog. And here in the field, we have food. So let's click send. As you can see here, it receives a response saying, no, it's not. Let's try to change it. Okay, and if we hit send, as you can see, saying it's a hub. So yeah, so this is how the Postman works. And let's again, just to recap the structure of this real quick. So first of all is listening. It's listening at localhost 3000. And whenever we receive a post request under this route, well, then first of all, get the request of body.field. Once we get the field value, we then compare it to hotdog. And if it is a hotdog, then we send back it is a hotdog. And if it is not a hotdog, we then send back no, it's not a hotdog. Does this make sense? Is this clear to everyone? Do we have any questions? Alrighty. Alrighty. So let's move on to this. Actually, before we move on, let's use Postman to test on this GET request as well. So for this GET request, we have already tested out using our browser, but just to make sure we understand how Postman works, let's create another request, add a request. Let's just call it GET. Hello world. To lesson 7. And we are sending a GET request, and as a result, GET here is correct. And we are going to be, instead of like localhost 3000 is hotdog, we're just going to localhost 3000. And let's hit save, and let's send. As you can see, we receive hello world inside Postman. All right, so right now we have this, we have already covered this post request. And this is one very classic way of like dealing with one type of user information. So usually for any forms, you will store all the user information inside the request body. However, there's usually also another way of storing users' information, and that's by changing the URL. So for instance, if you go on to like a blog post website, and usually you will see something like slash posts slash like 1234, and 1234 is kind of stands for the post ID. And that's kind of like another way of dealing with users' information. And here, right here, the information is essentially the post ID. And how do we do that? Is by doing posts followed by column and then ID. And this syntax essentially matches everything followed by post. So if it's like post ABCD, it will also match ABCD as the ID parameter. And if it's like posts 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the request of params ID will also becomes 1, 2, 3, 4. And yeah, to access it, we can request the params. Note that it's not body anymore because this is inside the URL parameter. So we can request the params followed by the field name, which is ID. Okay, and let's go ahead. And after we receive the ID, we simply send the ID back. And let's go ahead and test this out. And since this is a pull request, we also need to use Postman. And I have already created one here, so it's here put. And then inside this route here, you can see it's posts slash 123. And if this works as expected, we should be receiving 123 inside our response. So let's click send. Oops. Why did I change it to put? Okay, let's change it back to put. Let's click send. Okay. As you can see, we receive 123 in our response field. Let's say we change it to like A, B, 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 A, B, B, and send. As you can see, we received that. So yeah, this is kind of like just a way to access this parameter using Express. Do we have any questions on this part? Yeah. Do you want to see anything? Okay. Do you have any other questions? All right. Now, so yeah, this is how you will use Express to build out a very simple web server. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I will probably not cover file system. But essentially, file system, if you want to like double around, learn on your own, you can go to the 3 file system folder. And let me just point out a few key points. First of all, to use and to interact with the file system, you need to, first of all, do npm install fs. Fs stands for file system. And after you do that, you then need to import that particular package inside our package. And then it's all the same. And here is how you will, for instance, create a file. You do fs.append file, followed by the file name, and followed by kind of like the directory of the file. And in this case, we're just putting it like right here inside the current folder. So there's like nothing there. And followed by a callback message. And this callback message is essentially saying that once we have created this file, it will send back a message. And this message, it contains the message, file created, the name of the file, and the type of it. Okay, and to kind of like test out this route, as you can see, it's under app.post. So you need to use Postman to send a post request to that file. And but yeah, this is essentially all you need to do. And this is how you will interact with the file system. Essentially, the method that you need to remember is that we use fs.append file to create the file. And you can probably find other methods for file system just by Googling. So yeah, this is all the lecture for today. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you this Thursday. Sorry, give me 1 sec. Let me just